What time it is? You know what time it is. Hey, you know what time it is. Woo! Get into it! Yes! We're back, lovelies. We're back with Storytime with Chris. Hi. How's it going? Ooh. There we go. Lift my eyelashes up so I can not get poked in the eye later. Straight eyelash in the eye is never a fun time. Okay, that's way better. There we go. Alright. That's cool. Now I can see and not have an eyelash fly into my eye. It's so annoying. But we are back. We have one more chapter after tonight. And the plot thickens considering that Isadora and Duncan Quagmire, the Quagmire triplets, have changed places between Violet, Klaus, and Sunny so they can study for their comprehensive exams, because if they don't pass their comprehensive exams, they will be kicked out of Proof Rock Preparatory School, and then they will be given into the custody of Coach Genghis, which honestly, that's not how adoption works, nor does... There's a lot more paperwork with that. The children would obviously go to the closest relative or be taken in by the state. So yeah. Just a fun fact, that's not how that works. Like, they can't get kicked out of school and then their coach is like, oh yeah, I'm gonna take them in. Like, there's a bit more legality that goes with that. But, as we all know, Coach Genghis is secretly Count Olaf. I don't own the music in the background, so you know who it is, typically, that we have on here. It's Mr. Ambiance. Go check them out. Like, share, subscribe onto their channel. It's a good thing. It's a good thing. Chapter 12. Assumptions are dangerous things to make. And like all dangerous things to make, bombs, for instance, or strawberry shortcake, if you make even the tiniest mistake, you can find yourself in terrible trouble. Making assumptions simply means believing things are a certain way with little or no evidence that shows you are correct. And you can see at once how this can lead to terrible trouble. For instance, one morning you might wake up and make the assumption that your bed was in the same place that it always was, even though you would have had no real evidence that this was so. When you get out of your bed, you might discover that it had floated out to sea, and now you would be in terrible trouble, all because of the incorrect assumption that you'd made. You can see that it is better not to make too many assumptions, particularly in the morning. The morning of the comprehensive exams, however, the Baudelaire orphans were so tired, not only from staying up all night studying and making staples, but also from 9 consecutive nights of running laps, and that they had made plenty of assumptions, and every last one of them turned out to be incorrect. Well, that's the last staple, Violet said, stretching her tired muscles. I think we can safely assume that Sunny won't lose her job. And you seem to know every detail of Mr. Remora's stories as well as I know all of Mrs. Bass's measurements, Klaus said, rubbing his tired eyes. So I think we can safely assume that we won't be expelled. Niliko, Sun said, yawning her tired mouth. She meant something like, and we haven't seen either of the Quagmire triplets, so I think we can safely assume that their part of the plan went well. That's true, Klaus said. I'm assume if they'd been caught, we would have heard them by now. I'd make that same assumption, Violet said. I'd make that same assumption, came a nasty, mimicking voice, and the children were startled to see Vice Principal Nero standing behind them holding a huge stack of papers. In addition to the assumptions, the Baudelaires had made the assumption that they were alone, and they were surprised to find out not only Vice Principal Nero, but also Mr. Remora and Mrs. Bass waiting in the doorway of the orphan shack. I hope you've been studying all evening, Nero said, because I told your teachers to make these exams extra challenging, and the pieces of paper that the baby has to staple are very thick. Well, let's get started. Mr. Remora and Mrs. Bass will take turns asking you questions until one of you gets an answer wrong, then you flunk. Sunny will sit in the back and staple these papers into booklets of 5 papers each, and if your homemade staples don't work perfectly, then you flunk. Well, a musical genius, like myself, doesn't have all day to oversee exams. I've missed too much practice time as it is. Let's begin. Nero threw the papers into a big heap on one of the bales of hay, and the stapler right after it. Sunny crawled over as quickly as she could and began inserting the staples into the stapler, and Klaus stood up, still clutching the Quagmire notebooks. Violet put her noisy shoes back on her feet, and Mr. Remora swallowed a bit of banana and asked his first question. In my story about the doggy, he said, how many miles did the doggy run? 6, Violet said promptly. 6, Nero mimicked. That can't be correct, can it, Mr. Remora? Yes, actually, Mr. Remora said, taking another bite of banana. How wide, Mrs. Bass said to Klaus, was the book with the yellow cover? 19 inches, Klaus said immediately. 19 inches! Nero mocked. That's wrong, isn't it, Mrs. Bass? No, Mrs. Bass admitted. That's the right answer. Well, try another question, Mr. Remora, Nero said. In my story about the mushroom, Mr. Remora asked Violet, what was the name of the chef? Maurice, Violet answered. Maurice, Nero mimicked. Correct, Mr. Remora said. How long was chicken breast number 7? Mrs. Bass asked. 14 centimeters and 5 millimeters, Klaus said. 14 centimeters and 5 millimeters, Nero mimicked. That's right, Mrs. Bass said. You're actually both very good students, even if you've been sleeping through class lately. Stop all this chit-chat and flunk them, Nero said. I've never gotten to expel any students, and I'm really looking forward to it. Which is terrible, by the way. He should not be in the education system, nor should he be around children. If you enjoy flunking a kid out of school for bad grades, like, that's terrible. You should do the opposite. You should want that child to succeed rather than fail. Just saying. In my story about the dump truck, Mr. Remora said as Sonny began to staple the pile of thick papers into booklets, what color were the rocks that it carried? Gray and brown. Gray and brown? Correct. How deep was my mother's casserole dish? 6 centimeters. 6 centimeters? Correct. In my story about the weasel, what was his favorite color? The comprehensive exams went on, and if I were to repeat all the tiresome and pointless questions that Mr. Remora and Mrs. Bass asked, you might become so bored that you might go to sleep right here. Using this book as a pillow instead of as an entertaining and instructive tale to benefit young minds. Indeed, the exams were so boring that the Baudelaire orphans might normally have dozed through the test themselves, but they dared not doze. One wrong answer, an unstable piece of paper, and Nero would expel them from Proof Rock Preparatory School and send them into the waiting clutches of Coach Genghis. So the 3 children worked as hard as they could. Violet tried to remember each detail Klaus had taught her. Klaus tried to remember every measurement he had taught himself. And Sonny stapled like mad, a phrase which here means quickly and accurately. Finally, Mr. Remora stopped in the middle of his 8th banana and turned to Vice Principal Nero. Nero, he said, there's no use continuing these exams. Violet is a very fine student and has obviously studied very hard. Mrs. Bass nodded her head in agreement. In all my years of teaching, I've never encountered a more metric-wise boy than Klaus here, and it looks like Sonny is a fine secretary as well. Look at these booklets, they're gorgeous. Pleasant, Sonny shrieked. My sister means thank you very much, Violet said. Although Sonny really meant something more like, my stapling hand is sore. Does this mean we get to stay at Proof Rock Prep? Oh, let them stay, Nero, Mr. Remora said. Why don't you expel that Carmelita Spatz? She never studies, and she's an awful person besides. Oh, yes, Mrs. Bass said. Let's give her an extra challenging examination. I can't flunk Carmelita Spatz, Nero said impatiently. She's Coach Genghis's special messenger. Who? Mr. Remora asked. You know, Mrs. Bass explained. Coach Genghis, the new gym teacher. Oh, yes, Mr. Remora said. I've heard about him, but never met him. What is he like? He's the finest gym teacher the world has ever seen, Vice Principal Nero said, shaking his 4 pigtails in amazement. But you don't have to take my word for it. You can see for yourself. Here he comes now. Nero pointed one of his hairy hands out of the orphan shack, and the Baudelaire orphans saw with horror that the Vice Principal was speaking the truth, whistling an irritating tune. Coach Genghis was walking straight toward them, and the children could see at once how incorrect one of their assumptions had been. It was not the assumption that Sonny would not lose her job, although that assumption, too, would turn out to be incorrect. It was not the assumption that Violet and Klaus would not be expelled, although that, too, was a wrong one. It was the assumption about the Quagmire triplets and their part of the plan going well. Coach Genghis walked closer and closer. The Baudelaires saw that he was holding Violet's hair ribbon in one of his scraggly hands and Klaus's glasses in the other. And with every step of his expensive running shoes, the coach raised a small white cloud, which the children realized must be flour from the snitched sack. But more than the ribbon or the glasses or the small clouds of flour was the look in Genghis's eyes. As Coach Genghis reached the orphan's shack, his eyes were shining bright with triumph, as if he had finally won a game that he had been playing for a long, long time. And the Baudelaire orphans realized that the assumption about the Quagmire triplets had been very, very wrong indeed. I'll see you next time. That is where we will end for tonight. We have one more chapter before the end. Before we begin, the Ursax elevator has one of my favorite villains in it. I'm not going to say any more about it. That's how we spoil stuff. We don't want that. And also, y'all, I am continuing to read Stuart Little on Sundays for story time. I've skipped this past Sunday because that was the end of the Thanksgiving holiday weekend. So I will see you all next Sunday. This upcoming Sunday, I should say. Love you. Bye-bye.